All right, welcome to those that are watching today. My name is Scott Vass. I'm the advisory board member for the Canadian Strength Conditioning Association. And the focus of this month's newsletter is Canadians working in professional leagues. I decided to take my focus a little bit different, and we're going to be going on a professional consultant today who is working with professional leagues. So my guest for today is Derek Hansen. Derek is an international sports performance consultant and educator that has worked as a sprint coach and has been consulting with professional teams in the NFL, NBA, NHL, Major League Soccer, and Major League Basketball, and along with national team organizations and collegiate programs for over 20 years. He specializes in speed development, strategic performance planning, return to play protocols, and electrical stimulation technologies. He offers his consulting services through sprintcoach.com and educational courses being running mechanics.com. So thank you for your time today. Welcome, Derek.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Scott. It's a good way to spend a Sunday.
Yeah, awesome. All right, taking a little bit of time out of our NFL watching time right now. So Derek and I have a history going back. I was young wanted to be a strength conditioning coach coming out of Simon Fraser University, and Derek was actually one of the very first full-time strength coaches hired on at the Canadian level. And he was the first guy. I'd done a number of internships across the city. And when Derek came on board, he was the first guy I really talked to that was a whole nother higher level above pretty much everybody else that I'd worked with at the time. So I was fortunate enough to work as a graduate assistant for 3 years for him while he was up at SFU. So Derek, now, one of the things that I took a pretty traditional route where I had a sports science background. You took a little bit more of a unique route to actually becoming a full-time strength coach and working with professional athletes. It didn't come with a sports science degree, but you still worked your way up to the very top. So can you give us a little bit of a background on how you started out getting in the industry and where you ended up where you are now?
Yeah, it wasn't a plan. It wasn't a grand plan by any means. And I went to school and was an athlete in college and university. Did track and field for it was 5 years in the Canadian system. And then I went off to do my master's. That was at University of British Columbia. And then I did my master's in, it was like an urban transportation planning, civil engineer type program. And I went off to Montreal for McGill University. And I kind of thought like my sporting career was over. I'm like, okay, I'm going to focus on just academics because I was just wasting time when I was undergrad. But you get really bored quickly, and you're like, oh, well, I'll go help out with the track team. I'll just volunteer my services because I got to kill some time here. And then it just kind of took off from there in terms of like, oh, this coaching thing is quite interesting. Coach sprinters, hurdlers, jumpers, relays, and all that. And I was kind of put in charge. And the coach there was very good about just letting me do what I want to do. His name's Dennis Barrett. He's still there. And he also, understood a lot of the things around, lifting weights for track sprinting and plyometrics and all those things. So all the stuff that I did as an athlete, now I was coaching. So that gave me a lot of responsibility really quickly. So these are your athletes, make them better. And I think that was a huge leg up on a lot of people because you really got to see where your skills lay, right? In terms of like, okay, everybody's doing well, everybody's getting faster, and we got to deal with injuries. And from there, graduated. I think I did 3 years there as a coach, and then graduated, came back to Vancouver and said, okay, well, I guess I better get a job in what I went to school for, because that's what you're supposed to do, apparently. And I worked for 5 years for a municipal engineering firm that did everything from civil engineering to urban planning and it was a private consulting firm. So I started out as a consultant, which is very interesting. And if you've ever worked for sort of a private firm, it's pretty cutthroat in terms of what you're required to do, how you manage your time, how you're billed out for your time, how you get compensation, how you got to go in for meetings, you got to kind of negotiate what your compensation is. And you're out of school, you're like, I don't know, right? But it was, and then I had to go do meetings with, clients, which could be, engineering departments and people who are well more educated than I was. And then I had to go to public meetings and say like, hey, we're going to, do this in your community. And we're going to, and you have people screaming and yelling at you. I don't know if you've ever been to a municipal public meeting. but you're like, okay, this is what the data shows. Like, this data sucks. You're an idiot, right? And I'm like, oh, okay, which prepares you for being a strength coach, actually. So the the whole process of that 5 years, like you look back at it and you go like, wow, I learned a lot in 5 years being in that environment. And I had very good mentors, like people who were very precise in everything they did. They're engineers. And I also had one guy who was really good at presenting and writing, and he made an effort to go and present at conferences and write articles and things. And this was back in like the 90s, right before the internet, and really before like social media or anything like that. So, and he took a lot of courses through oh the I can't remember the guy's name. Oh, it's not Toastmasters, but it's the other one. The guy who wrote like How to Make Friends and deal with people, and how to communicate effectively. It'll come to me, but it's yeah, so he took all these courses. So he was really good at communicating and speaking, and he kind of
I
harped on that all the time. And I don't know, I don't feel comfortable doing that. And then when somebody forces you to do that, now it's like, oh, geez, okay. So actually doing it, that's another lesson, right? Like going and putting yourself in an uncomfortable situation and doing it really, you either got to sink or swim, right? So Dale Carnegie courses, that's what he took. So, anyways, yeah, so that was really helpful, and you kind of look at that and you go like, well, what was more useful, going to school or actually being put in a scenario where you had to learn on the spot and learn how to do your job? And if I were to pick, I would say like just go out and work. um, so that kind of stuck with me as well, as in terms of like, okay, I've got to prove myself, and I got to do it in a certain amount of time because I'm being billed for that time. And it was really interesting. And then but the whole time while I was doing that, I was still kind of coaching on the side, because again, you're trying to balance things out. And I still coach track athletes. I started to do in the late 90s, I started to do some strength and conditioning, around speed again. And work with local soccer teams. Then I started working with some national teams that were based out of Vancouver, like and sports that I didn't really have a great affinity for, which is okay too. So I work with like the men's national field hockey program, who were going to the Olympics in 2000. And you're like, oh, okay, field hockey. I didn't even know guys played field hockey, right? So I work with them. Great group of guys, group of coaches, and work with other physical therapists. One of them was Tyler Dumont, who's out in Surrey, and great guy. So I have a history with a lot of people who worked in that system back then, and just again learn how to work 2 or 3 times a week, getting people to do their weightlifting and speed, and going out and watching practices, in a sport that I was unfamiliar with. And then I work with, I think, women's softball Olympic team, and just other things like everything from speed skating, bobsleigh. And I did the whole sort of gambit of the national teams, provincial teams, and it was good stuff. But all at the same time, I was also coaching track and working to some higher levels there as well. And I think just having that sort of random experience was pretty useful, I think, in the beginning. And you always try to look back and think what was important, and I would say all of it was pretty important. So that's kind of how I got at least started in the industry and the system. It was like track, working with other sports, and the whole time kind of getting to know people in the system, because that's very important as well in terms of getting work.
Perfect. So when we met, you were just making the transition from a full-time consulting job into actually full-time strength conditioning. How did the Simon Fraser University job open up for you? How did you get your foot in the door as a full-time strength coach? And could you comment on your experience? Because one of the things that I know from being up there as an athlete for a number of years, working within the athletics department can be very challenging up there. There's a lot of politics you have to deal with. There's a lot of red tape that you have to go through to get your job done. You're dealing with a lot of different coaches with competing interests. You have time commitment issues. Can you maybe just comment on how you ended up with the job, how you found the job as a whole? Because from what I recall, you were there for over a decade. And then how did it shape how you ended up where you are today?
Yeah, I think first time I think they were starting a position, um, and I think there was a bunch of things happening from a budgeting point of view. So they wanted to have that position. I think they were going to expand a gym. They were hoping to get the Olympic Oval as part of the Olympics, and so there were a lot of things happening. And the softball coach for the national team was the softball coach for the Simon Fraser team. So I think he tipped me off and said, "Oh, you should apply." And I'm like, "Yeah, okay, whatever." I was doing a bunch of other things, and I think it was just sort of like, yeah, I'll try it. I'll put it in. Went and then got uh, called in for shortlisted for an interview and did the interview. Um, and eventually got the job. I don't, I have no idea if I did well in the interview, but I got the job. But um, and it was just sort of you kind of fell into it, which is weird. Like most of the stuff I do. Um, and then, like you said, once you get up there, it's like and we could sit here and we could pick and go like, oh, this is what was wrong and this is what's great, but you're dropped into a situation where everybody was kind of left to their own devices. So if you're a sport coach over here or over here, like you said, everybody was just surviving, and they had some good programs. Like the wrestling program had a lot of successes, and a lot of people from the football program went off to play pro ball, even though the football program wasn't known as like being like very successful in terms of like playoffs and winning championships and all that, but still had a good reputation. So you had all these things sort of coexisting, but not really, I would say, communicating formally. And so you drop somebody in who says, "Okay, I'm gonna be in charge of like doing all your conditioning," and then it took like I never really gelled, but certainly it took a lot of work to just get people to work together. And like you said, there's limited facilities, there's limited resources, so everybody's kind of jockeying and fighting, and it was just a weird situation. But I think, again, you got to look back and go, okay, well, what was positive out of that? Well, I got to meet you, which really kind of spawned sort of like the development of an internship program that we had talked about. And so, got people working and developed that dynamic around teaching people how to train athletes while you're training athletes. So that was kind of cool. The facilities were, subpar on many levels, but I think it's just again, when you're put into an adverse situation and not everybody's helping you out, you learn to fend for yourself, right? So you have to adapt. And would it have been nice if we had better facilities, we had a budget for equipment, we had a budget for paying coaches great wages? Yes, it would have been really good, but I a lot of the programs that I consult with now, a lot of the Division 1 programs, you see they have like, you know, 10 strength coaches and great weight rooms for every sport, but the training isn't, very good in some cases. So, you know, it's really easy to sit back and go, well, yeah, it should be perfect, but it never quite is. So you just have to learn how to shift and raise money here and suck up to this coach over here because they haven't been treated well previously, so they're a bit insecure, and all these things are really important. And if you go into a situation where they haven't had somebody controlling strength and conditioning, it's going to be really tough. Like because people don't know how to work in that dynamic, right? If you go in there and you replace somebody who did something different and you want to change things, it's going to be tough, right? It's never going to be perfect. You're never going to slide in and just keep doing what everybody was doing before. It's going to be different, and I hear these stories all the time from people transitioning. And it's nice if you are just working with one sport and you're like the football strength coach and the coach brought you in and you have control and power and buy-in. That's very, different than if you're brought in to work with 10 teams and nobody really likes you, like, because they don't know who you are, right? Like, you might have a few people like you, but I've had situations where like this coach really liked me, and because this coach has a feud with that coach, they hate me because that coach likes me, or stupid stuff like that, where you're like, really? Like, I don't have a dog in the fight, right? But That's just the way it is. I mean, it's the same if you went to go work in an office or work at a school. Like there's
Yeah.
teachers that hate each other. There's coworkers that hate each other. Pro teams. I've been involved with pro teams who've gone on to do great things, and the athletic trainer won't talk to the strength coach or the somebody else, the equipment guy, or so. This is the reality. So the more that you understand that that's potentially could happen, then you just prepare yourself and go like, okay. So it's been bizarre.
Yeah.
And you can only and I would say you can only do that so long. Like if you're in that situation, and it takes a lot of energy. So, naturally at some point I had to make a decision like, hey, look, I got to do something different. And we can talk a bit about that, how that was set up. But yeah, I don't think you look back at any experience and go like, hey, that wasn't worthwhile. I think you go,
Yeah.
okay, I got some good things. There's some things I'm going to be careful with moving forward because I could have handled that better. And I think you really got to look at it that way. Like, how could I have handled that situation better? Even though you could argue like this person was in the wrong, I probably still could have handled a lot of things better. So,
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, but you just get to the point, like you said, where it's enough's enough, and you've sort of had your run there. You had a very successful run, but it was time to move on. Um, what prompted you to finally make that decision, and how did that transition into becoming a professional consultant occur?
um, I think that's probably the first question to answer is like, you kind of set things up by creating some awareness around your abilities and your skill set. And so one of the easiest ways to do that initially was to start writing about things that I was doing and my opinions on how I think things should be done. And I started doing that maybe like late 2008, 2009, 2010. So I just started writing, and I had a website, a blog, um, and luckily some stuff got picked up, and I had people asking me like, oh, can you provide more information on that? One of the guys that I know really well was Mark Uyama, and he was at the time when I first started sort of communicating with him, and we're both from like lower mainland Vancouver area, right? So he was from Steveston, and we had a few I think common friends, and um, I think I started talking with him, and he was an assistant at San Francisco 49ers at the time, and then eventually he became the head strength coach, and moved on to Minnesota. So just having somebody like that to talk to and go like, hey, what's happening with where you're at, and getting some ideas of some of the struggles he's having in working with coaches and getting athletes ready. So having people like that, I've had other people like Al Vermeil, who was a mentor and somebody that I talked to almost every day for a while there when he was still working. And just having that sort of mentor or person to talk to. And then of course I had Charlie Francis, who helped on more of the, I would say, the philosophical and the approach to training speed. And then another friend was Rob Panarello, who was a physical therapist in New York City. And I think he had like 2 or 3 clinics when I first met him back in 2000, 2001. And now he's got 200 clinics all over the East Coast. And having people like that to go, hey, what do you think of this? And they would also bring me into some of their projects. So, try this with your athlete. Baseball athlete had a hamstring injury. So I said, Rob, why don't you try this? And it worked. So you're building credibility, you're building connections, but you're also building credibility with those connections, because you're giving them something and they're helping you with something. So if there's a sort of equal trade-off, it works really well. Whereas if I just come to you and say, Scott, like, hey, I don't know anything, can you just tell me everything I need to know about strength and conditioning?
Yeah.
That doesn't help you. It just irritates you, right? But if I said, hey, I'll come and clean all your weights during COVID, and then it's a little better. But so I think those types of relationships are important. And then on top of it, you have articles that people can go and read, and now it's podcasts and interviews and all those sorts of things. But back then, just getting the ability to write, which I had to do back in my consulting job, in the 90s. And I think that really helped. The ability to communicate your ideas was very important early on in my career. And now I was doing that while I was still working at the university. And over time I just started working with teams as sort of a side gig, because they had an interest in what I was doing and the thoughts that I had. And then so when you get to a point where you're like, well, I kind of had enough with this job, like it's just and there's other things that happen. Like my wife had spent all of her time, she's a teacher as well, and she had spent all this time kind of bringing up the kids. We have 3 kids, and so at some point we decided like, hey, maybe you should have a chance to go back to work full time, and she could do that, and she had a good situation. So it made it easier for me to say, hey, okay, I'll leave this job, where benefits are handled by your job. And so a lot of things worked out very well to allow that to happen. But certainly there's decisions you're making along the way to set that up. And if you feel like you're being burnt out in a current situation, and you feel like you don't have control over it, probably a good time to start looking for other options. But I would say that probably was a 4 or 5 year, and I'd probably even talk to you about it well before it actually happened. But yeah, it's not like, ah, I don't like my job, I'm leaving right now. It's you got, that'd be very stressful, and it's still stressful when you decide to change anything, right? So but yeah, it just was a sort of a confluence of factors that came together, and it's like, yeah, I got this work. I know I'll be good for at least the next year and a half, and then you just kind of build on it, and out of necessity, you start to kind of hustle and do some more things to make yourself more viable. So
Perfect. No, it's good. So you talked about setting yourself up, making the connections, having the network all set up in there. Um, so when you first started out and people were bringing you in, when I'm bringing somebody in for us in Canada to work with their integrated support team, or even at the school as an athletic director, bringing somebody in to work with our PE department as a consultant, I'm bringing them in to fill a gap that we're not good at. We have some very excellent people across the board, but what you're really looking at is somebody that's an expert in a niche area. Um, they've You've become an expert in a number of niche little areas across the board. When people are bringing you on board, are they asking you? So if a strength coach from the NFL is bringing you on board, are they coming in to talk to you about something specific like hamstring injuries? Did they bring you in to look at their holistic program? So what are they bringing you in? What gaps are they bringing in for you to address personally yourself? How do you help these teams out? And have you seen big glaring differences? I'm curious more than anything about the differences you've seen in strength conditioning for the various sports that you've worked with. Is there a big difference between Major League Baseball and Major League Soccer, the NFL? Do you see any big glaring deficiencies? Throwing a lot at you here, but I'll just open it up if you want to talk to any of that.
um yeah, usually I'm brought in for a specific reason. So like you said, it could be a specific issue around hamstring injuries, like incidents or return to play timelines. Like it's just they're not turning it around fast enough. Um, and or a team says, hey, we want to just generally as a team get faster. How do we do that? How do we teach the staff? And I will say that if you are a consultant and you say like, this is what I'm good at, it's still difficult for you to get work. But as soon as you start packaging it, like anything, like if you say, okay, this is my speed package, or my people will buy it more than if you just say, yeah, bring me in as a consultant. And I found that a lot with my certification courses around running mechanics. As soon as I created running mechanics courses and it had full course descriptions and it was a tangible product, it's going to be way easier. Now, having said that, people will do that, and they will still bring me in as a consultant, or varieties of that. But you give people options, and I think that's really important nowadays. Is people don't want to think too much, so it's like, yes, I need that. Let's do that. So it depends on the teams. Like you said, there's a lot of variability in terms of what they want, and some people will have a budget and they'll say like, okay, $10,000 a year, we're going to do something for professional development, so we'll bring this guy in. So sometimes you'll be brought in, you're thinking, oh, right, this is great, they think I'm awesome, right? And then next year they'll bring in some guy who's like a Bosu ball expert, and you're like, oh god, geez, they're just spending their anyway. So whatever, like just be happy you got the job. But sometimes they'll bring you in and say, we want a long-term relationship with you, and we want you to handle the speed stuff or the hamstring rehab. And so that's kind of what happened with Kansas City, and that was kind of a 5-year relationship, and there's still a relationship moving forward. um And then, the Toronto Maple Leafs have kind of indicated that they want to do that too. So I was brought in pre-COVID, and then COVID hit. So I didn't really get to do a lot with them aside from do some initial teaching with their staff. So it depends on who's bringing you in, right? So if the owner brings you in, that's probably a lot different than if the strength coach brings you in. Because if just the strength coach brings you in, you're probably just working with that person or that group. It doesn't mean you'll have an impact on maybe what the athletic trainers do or the sports science people. But if the performance director brings you in and all those people fall in under that guy, then now you have a little more latitude to work with everybody. So I think it really depends on who brings you in, and like you said, what they specify as their need. If you come in and you get your foot in the door and then you say like, hey, you guys are horrible at doing hang cleans, right? They didn't bring me in to do that, right? They didn't say like, I want you just to vet everything. They want me to handle speed. So you may walk in there and they're doing something pretty crazy. It's really not my place to say anything about that. I can talk about what I do and what I'm good at and what I think they should do. And then, if they ask, like, what do you think of our weightlifting? I'm like, well, I'd still be very careful about what I commented on. I'd say, you know what? I don't prioritize weightlifting as much when I look at speed, and just have an answer ready for that. But I think you have to be really careful with any of this stuff. And I think I'm even going to start a whole certification course around how do I work as a consultant, because there's lots of things that you have to understand. If you bring me in and you say, I want you just to work on starts. Okay, great. Let's work on starts. Like, hey, you guys look like you're doing pretty good so far. I would just change this. Like I'm kind of a minimalist in terms of my recommendations, because it's so easy to go in there and start breaking furniture, and nobody likes that. Nobody wants to hear you talk about nutrition, right? If that's what they brought you in for, then talk about nutrition or pre-workout or whatever post-workout. But I'm very, very careful about that, because I've heard enough stories about people coming into a system or an organization and just trying to be a know-it-all on everything, and we don't like that. Like, I don't like that. Like, I've been married for 20 years. I don't like being told like that I suck at stuff. So I think that's a huge part of what I do, is that I understand what my role is, and I understand where I can add value. Could I add value in other places? Sure, but it's really not my place, and nor was I brought in for that reason. So I think understanding what your boundaries are is really important as part of any of this. And I would think, even if I was hired full time as an employee, I think I understand that bit a little bit more about what people's boundaries are and what people's sensitivities are around their job versus your job. And that's a huge part of just getting along in an organization. So
Yeah. While you've been in working with these teams, just to expand on that, I'm just curious more than anything. Do you see any differences in strength conditioning between the different sports? Like this sport tends to be very good at developing this quality and not quite as good over here, but you get into soccer, they have a different sort of mindset over here where they work on that. Any comments on the strength conditioning practices between the different sports?
um I would say, like, I don't know. I don't necessarily I think it's by organization more than by sport, but certainly you'll hear things like, well, soccer doesn't like lifting, and or basketball doesn't like, lifting, and also, and there's some truth to that. So if you go work with an NBA team, you, you have to be very careful about exercise selection and what people have done and what players are used to or comfortable with. And a lot of that will stem from not necessarily what the organization does, but what their personal trainer does with them in the off season, because that person has more control, that person has more time with them than what would happen necessarily in a team setting, right? As you know, there's very little time in a pro team setting where you can work with them and do a full program, because the off season everybody takes off. So there has to be a bit of sensitivity around, well, what do you like? What do you do in the off season? Not that that's right, but then
Yeah.
that's a good place to start, right? And then you can start talking about, doing things a little differently. But I think that's the biggest obstacle in pro sport. It's not like this team doesn't, or this sport doesn't like doing Olympic lifting. I would say for the most part, most pro teams don't do Olympic lifting because it's difficult. Like it's you need to spend time on it, and it's not as fun as everybody in CrossFit thinks. So you got a guy who's 6'10" and doesn't like lifting. Well, you got to figure out what he does like. And as soon as you pay somebody to play a sport, they feel they have a little more entitlement and ownership around what they do. So and the unions and the collective bargaining agreements kind of support the players more than they do what the staff wants to do. So it's this real difficult thing to figure out, where you're like, okay, well, which makes it easier for me to come in as more of a sprint guy, because it's like, oh, what do I have to do? You have to run from point A to point B. Oh, I can do that, right? As long as it's not excessive. But as soon as you start picking exercises that require a learning curve, and maybe, like if you get, oh, the entire team has to do Zercher squats, like, okay, you're not going to last too long in that NBA team. So, you have to be really careful about what you're prescribing based on, what their tolerances are, what their comfort zones are. And I would say, football tends to be more weightlifting oriented, yes. But even in football, you'll see some of the skill players don't like lifting, right? Some of the best players in the league aren't great lifters. And as soon as you see that, you're like, oh, okay, well, I guess sports specific or whatever they're good at is way more important than how good they can, lift a weight in the weight room. Like that's where it really hits you. Whereas, at the high school level, it makes a difference. Like that, if you have strength and you can express that in the weight room, you're going to be useful on the field. But if everybody's running 4.3 seconds in the 40 and you're, worried about your power clean, you don't belong on the field. So I think it just changes significantly once you get up to higher levels, and you have to have a little more flexibility around what you require of the athlete, because guess what? He's getting paid 30 million a year to throw a ball, right? And maybe move a little bit, right, with his feet, but and read the defense. So, I think that's something that you just have to be aware of, is that yes, there are sort of cultural differences around what athletes want to do and what teams do. Like I would say there's this great divide between what the strength coach in the NFL wants to do and what the players will do, right? And so we could go to a strength and conditioning convention for all the NFL coaches, and they'll be talking about, let's look at this weight equipment and let's look at, how to lift this and body, and then that's an entirely different subculture than what actually happens when they go back and work. And I think people need to recognize that, like, yeah, we all like watching people like, clean and jerk, 500 pounds over their head. Nobody does that in the NFL. So, just make sure you divide those two things up and understand what is important and what's not. Um, so how you train is going to be different than how you coach people to train in a lot of scenarios. So I think as soon as people recognize that, um, then it's a lot easier to work in those environments. Having said that, you don't want to go so far to one end of that spectrum and go like, I'll just let the players do whatever the hell they want. Like you need some structure and some discipline around getting them to do what they need to do as well. So, and you see that a lot too, where people are just mailing it in going, yep, we won a championship. Maybe it has something to do with me. Maybe it doesn't. I just want to keep my job. And I understand those situations too, but you have to be always kind of pushing a little bit here and there on the edges and making sure things are moving forward. And you're doing your job. So
Awesome. So you've obviously done a lot of work with the NFL and pro football in general. The NFL brought you into the combine, I believe, to present on preventing hamstring injuries and hamstring rehab protocols. I saw you wrote a couple articles and had some infographics up there about the NFL starting back up after the COVID. And one of the infographics I saw was, okay, here's how they should start back up, and here's how they are probably going to start back up based on what the requirements are. Because of the way they started back up, there's been a ton of injuries in the league this year. Is there anything you think from what you've seen that the NFL could have done differently with their teams to actually prevent some of those injuries from happening? Or is it just financially and time-wise, here's what we have, we got to start up, we got to go, and then you got to deal with it? Could anything differently have been done from your mind?
As a strength coach in the league, no. Like if you're a strength coach, like you're at the whim of the owners and the league itself and the coaching staff, right? And so if somebody says this is the timeline that you have before our first game, guess who has the first call and what happens? It's going to be the head coach, right?
Yeah.
So this is, and what is the head coach worried about? Scheme, simulations, right? So it's going to be more of a practice based, football specific approach. And then, here's your 5 minutes to do your warm up. Here's your 30 minutes to get your lift in twice a week. And then even getting extra running in, well, it's going to be part of that 5 or 10 minute warm up. And so it's a real difficult situation. At least before this season, you would have an off season where they could, have some dedicated strength and conditioning, and you could kind of teach some of the athletes what your expectations are around their preparation. And even that's imperfect, right? But now you have a situation where you have a sort of a bizarre training camp where I think things were kind of phased a little differently than before. So you had to do some strength and conditioning for the first week or two, and then you had to do non-padded practices for a period, and then so it was drawn out. And I think they were trying to do some good things. The problem is, once you got past that, then it just jumped back up, right? And they were into full training camp, and it was tough, because a lot of the teams would, if they said you could have 2-a-days before, well, we're not doing 2-a-days, but we're going to have 1 3-hour practice. So now they're trying to cram two 2-hour practices into a 3-hour window, and they're not changing the amount of work. The density just increases. So that's always a problem, is that, hey, they're looking at their practice plan and going, we got to get all this in. So then, rest times are compromised and everything's just squished in. So I think that's part of the problem this year more than anything. And then the lack of preseason games is a problem as well, because you had a chance to kind of phase people in. Not everybody was playing the entire game, and starters would play 1 quarter and then another 2 quarters of the next game and 3 quarters, and some would play even less, but at least you got exposure to the game in digestible pieces, which they didn't have. Now it's like, okay, let's play our first game, and you're playing the whole bloody game. So you could argue that we have more injuries this year, but I think it's rounding out to be, well, it's about the same, because we didn't have that preseason period where a lot of injuries in August occur. So half the ACLs, if you have 50 ACLs in a season, now you have 25 in August, because, well, we got all these bodies slamming into each other and training camp, everybody's competing, and you have preseason games. So you have a lot of injuries, but you have more people to spread those injuries over. So you have like 100+ guys in a roster, and you're shaving it down. And so, yes, we have maybe about the same injuries now. I think it's 23 ACLs and 11 Achilles tendon ruptures and lots of hamstrings, right? But that's happening in a smaller period now over a smaller roster. So that's why I think we're seeing, more coverage of this. Whereas the guy who was the walk-on or undrafted free agent who tore his ACL in a preseason game on a punt, we didn't hear about that guy. But as soon as, Bosa does it in a 49ers game on a suspect field or whatever, now everybody's up in arms about it. So, it's a little distorted because it's just very different right now. And I think, we're going in week 5, and those numbers are pretty high for 5 weeks, I would say, for ACLs, and the fact that it's happening to starters and top players, it's kind of front and center. I'm hoping that you kind of get through the first wave, and then it starts to level off a bit. But a lot of people I've talked to said they don't think that's going to happen. There's still lots of stuff happening that's creating problems. So if you say, okay, Tennessee has 24 positive COVID tests. Well, then you can't go to the facility. You can't train. I think they were trying to train off on a high school field, and they got, nailed for that. And so you have all this disruption outside of their normal preparation. I would like to see, when Tennessee plays their first game, how many injuries they have because of that disruption. The Patriots, right? The same. So I think it's just all of these things are out of the norm in terms of their normal pattern of practicing and training. And then you might have to play games closer together because a game got pushed, right? So you got pushed to a Tuesday, then you got to turn around and play Sunday, which is not normal. And then bye weeks are going to get squeezed out too. So it's just going to be nuts, and it's really outside the control of the strength and conditioning coach. And I think that's where, as a professional, you can't be anxious and have anxiety. You will still have anxiety because you see guys get injured. It's not good. Or if you lose games. Um, but I would say it's so out of your control right now. I don't even know what this is a scheduling issue. This is a COVID testing issue, right? Like I was talking to Kent Johnson, who's at Carolina, um, and that's his big role there. He's the wellness guy, and so he's making sure that guys are taken care of with regards to COVID testing and if they've got a quarantine and then how they get back into the system. And so it's really difficult right now. I mean, I don't even know how to explain it.
Awesome. Well, it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. Last thing I sort of want to wrap up with today is right now we're talking about working at the professional level. And to be realistic, there are very, very few jobs at that level. There's few jobs at the university level. Like me as a full-time high school strength coach, there's probably about 5 of us in Canada. So when you go into full-time strength conditioning industry, there's not a lot of jobs out there. And the other thing is that one of the things you taught me very early on is to be good at your job, you have to have a diverse skill set. You got me into a lot of the rehab stuff. That I took a job full-time rehab for a while, just to learn to get better at working with athletes because of that skill set. And one of the other things I think that I'd like to think I do a fairly decent job at is managing personalities. And it's allowed me to make some connections and be a good job in the management sort of role. I've also through you made a ton of connections. Now, because of my diverse skill set, ton of connections and the way that I can deal with people and interact with people, which is, I think it's dealing with a lot of, if you're in an athletic industry, there's a lot of strong personalities out there. That's the kind of skill set that you need. But having that skill set, I think the word you used earlier in a conversation we had was agile. It allows me to be very agile. I'm never going to be out of work because I have skill set that I can take in this direction or this direction or this direction. There's a lot of people that are being forced to make new decisions in their career paths right now, especially because of COVID. I know we've got an article coming out at Simply Faster on having a diverse skill set and being able to change that, being agile and where you're going with your role. Could you comment on what set of skill sets that you find is really necessary to be an effective athletic development coach, and what people should really be focusing on with their career pathways in the future, especially with everything that's going on in our whole COVID world right now?
Yeah, it's a really tough situation, and I would say that like we discussed, it's across the board in all industries right now. I mean, unless you're in healthcare, to some degree, education, or work at a grocery store, like those are kind of the essential services right now. But I would say one of the things you have to do is, I mean, you really got to teach yourself to fish, rather than just, eating fish, right? And that's always been an issue, I think, in making yourself marketable. So, I think the big thing that you said was the people side, the management of personalities and communicating well and being positive around all of that. If you can communicate well and you can get your ideas out and you can bring people on side, that's probably the biggest thing. You talked about strong personalities, and a lot of people get jobs because they're just strong personalities. And sometimes the guy who shouts a lot, it's directly inversely related to their intelligence, right? Like I got to shout more because I don't really know a lot, right? So, but it does work. So I'm not saying you go out there and you be a yeller and a screamer, but certainly you have to be able to get your ideas across. And like I said, whether that's being better at speaking, being better at writing, I think both of those things are really important. So if you aren't doing that right now, find ways to put yourself in front of people and speak. Find ways to get your stuff written and get your ideas out there. Now, having said that, you better have some good ideas before you start speaking, right? I think, and there's a lot of people out there who are very good at speaking and get people on side and motivate people. And maybe they've put the cart ahead of the horse right there, because a lot of their information and content could be a lot better. So I was very careful about that. I didn't like go out there and start writing articles with only like 5 years experience. I probably waited about 20 years before I said, okay, this is what I've seen, this is what I think. And I think that's really difficult now, because if you just go on Instagram, you'll see like, hey, that person has 2 million followers and really doesn't know what they're talking about. So you want to have both of those things going on. You want to be able to communicate well, but you want to have great ideas as well that work, that get results. And I think that's something that requires some patience. And I think that's probably the biggest thing right now, is that, oh, I gotta figure this out now. It's like, well, no, like I told you, like it took me like 4 years to really transition out of a job. But I understood that I wanted to do that, and I had to take time doing that. So time is going to be part of this. So if you're figuring out hatching up a plan right now, you're not going like, I'm gonna hit the ground running in December or in January. One, it's not really good, because we don't, we're going to be in the midst of this pandemic in flu season and whatever in the winter. So maybe set your sights on like spring, but that still gives you a lot of time to kind of build things up and work on some virtual stuff. And I think my master's degree was in planning. And I think that's something that has always stuck with me. Is like, you have to have a sequential plan around everything you're doing. It doesn't have to be bang on exactly as it should be, but conceptually you should know where you have to go with this, and the boxes that you have to check off. And I think a lot of people don't do that. They don't look at the individual steps and go, okay, well, I got to do this first. I got to have a website, and then I got to, make an article, and then should have a bunch of articles to outline my expertise. And then I have to have social media to connect with people and then get your articles out. And you still have to go and talk to people, and like you said, having a good network of people, because as soon as you get people on side, then they can say, hey, Scott's doing something really good, I'm going to send it out to my followers. And I think that's, for a lot of people, that's tough. Like, they think, well, that's so superficial. I mean, you could argue that it is, but at the same time, that's the way that we communicate now. And that's the way it's going to be moving forward. Now, I don't have a really robust TikTok account, but apparently that's a good way to get out information if you're drinking cranberry juice, right? So I think that's something that you have to look at, is like, how are people connecting? Oh, okay. Maybe I should look into that. Well, it doesn't really work for me, but at least you looked at it. And I think it's so easy to go like, this is how we used to do it. um, and you got to look at new options for getting your ideas out. I don't think, like we talked about, the communication, like speaking to people and writing, that's not going to change. But certainly the mediums that you get that stuff out are changing constantly, right? You don't know what's going to be like. I couldn't tell you what's going to happen in May and what's going to be the best way to get your information out. It could change. Like podcasts, everybody has a podcast now, right? Like it's reached a saturation point. So what is the next level of that? I don't know, but you got to keep your eyes out for that. And you got to, you know, keep working on developing yourself, because it's going to take time, right? It's going to take, there's very few overnight successes. And then anytime you hear about an overnight success, you hear that person's been working like 10 years, because Eddie Van Halen passed. You go back and you see what everything he did, and it started from his childhood, and it started from his father's influence and playing music. And then they started a band in the early 70s, and they really took off in around 78, 80. So it took about 10 years for them to hit their stride. So, but that was a lot of preparation, and everybody's like, oh, where did they come from? But it was a lot of hard work.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for all the time you put in today. I think you did a really excellent job at telling your own story and giving some information to the people out there. A lot of the people that are watching this might not make it into a full-time strength conditioning gig at the university level or the pro level, but it gives them a lot of different skills and thoughts about what they need to be thinking about to actually develop themselves professionally, to get up to the place where they might not end up being in the pros like you are. But I think this is more than anything, it's just that whole framework that you just gave us in this conversation is something that you can develop, take, and make yourself excellent at whatever you end up going into.
Yeah, I don't think, like, again, I never said to you like, hey, Scott, when we first met, I'm going to be in the pros, right? Like, you kind of just work where you are and you create opportunities, and then something may come available. But that could be in a private gym setting, that could be working at a high school, that could be working at a college, that could be working at a university. You don't know, like, but you have to do your job well, first and foremost, whatever you're doing right now. It could be with a fitness guy, it could be working with young kids. Do it well, and then that'll create opportunities to do other things. And I think that's, you know, a lot of the people that are in pro sports, maybe they had this desire to do it, but a lot of it was because maybe they knew somebody and somebody said, "Hey, I'm going to work at this team. You want to come with me?" Right. But that was, like we talked about, having a connection and having people that trust you. Right. So, I don't know if there's any formula around it aside from like just be very good at what you do and be very good at communicating your ideas and connecting with people. And if you decide like, hey, yeah, I want to do the pro sports thing, because I know a lot of people who said, I want to be a pro sports strength coach, and for whatever reason it's not working out because they haven't checked all those other boxes off around their skill set, their communication, their likability, right? So, or maybe they just haven't had luck yet. So
Awesome. Well, before we do take off, I have to thank you for helping develop that skill set in me, because I am where I am today. You put in so many hours. I was like, for those of you that aren't out there, I spent like so much time around Derek on the track watching him. And not only did I learn skills for speed development and injury rehab, I learned communication skills, dealing with tough situations. And I am where I am today because of all the time and effort you put in for me. So just before we take off, I really wanted to thank you for everything that you did on behalf of that. And thank you for taking the time to do the interview today for us.
yeah, well, it's good that we had that time back then, because if I had to convince you now, I'd be like, no, don't do it, man. Like, don't become a dentist. Yeah, so I
Yeah.
mean, it's just the way it worked out. But yeah, I mean, again, it was on you. Like, you
Yeah.
could say that I did this for you and all this, but you worked hard and you did what you did because of you, because of the effort. So, yeah, if anybody wants to contact me, I'd be glad to offer advice. But at the same time, like, you gotta follow it up with hard work, and you got to do it on your own too. So.
Awesome. If people do want to reach out and contact you, what's the best way for them to either get a hold of you or to read more of your information?
I hate to say it, but it seems like Instagram is the best way. Like, you can send me a direct message on Instagram at Derek M Hansen. Um, yeah, if you, again, 5 years ago, if you said like Instagram, I'm relying on that for a lot of my connections, I'd say you're an idiot. But yeah, that's just how it worked out. So that's probably the easiest way. And then you can obviously runningmechanics.com or sprintcoach.com or the sites I have. But I'm less and less reliant on static websites now. It's more just the fluidity of like some of the social media platforms. So
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. I will let you go and enjoy the rest of your Sunday morning, watch a little bit of football, and get your house painted.
thanks a lot, Scott.
All right. Thanks so much, Derek.